Late on a Saturday night in May 2025, the warm Mediterranean air of Fuengirola, Spain, carried the distant sounds of celebration from Monaghan's Irish bar. Inside, punters had been watching the Champions League final, their voices mixing with the clatter of glasses and the familiar comfort of a Glasgow accent thousands of miles from home. The Costa del Sol has always been a magnet for those seeking sun, sangria, and sometimes sanctuary from their past lives. For some, it's retirement paradise. For others, it is the last stop on a journey that began in the gritty streets of Scotland's largest city. Ross Monaghan, the bar's 40-year-old owner, had built what seemed like the perfect new life. His establishment was popular with British expats and tourists alike, a slice of Irish hospitality transplanted to Spanish soil. To casual observers, he was simply another successful emigrant who traded Glasgow's grey skies for Mediterranean sunshine. But as the evening wound down and the last customers filtered into the night, the shadows of Monaghan's past were already closing in. At approximately 11:30 p.m., as stragglers made their way home through Fuengirola's quiet streets, a car pulled up outside the pub with the deliberate precision that marks professional violence. A masked figure emerged, moving with the kind of calculated purpose that transforms an ordinary Saturday night into a scene of carnage. What happened next would send shockwaves through the international criminal underworld and mark a brutal climax to one of Britain's longest-running gang wars. The gunman opened fire at point-blank range, his weapon cutting through the warm Spanish air with deadly accuracy. Two men fell almost instantly: Rose Monan, the pub owner, who thought he'd escaped his past, and Eddie Lyons Jr., a visitor whose very surname carried decades of blood and betrayal. As quickly as the violence erupted, it was over. The shooter vanished into the night, leaving holidaymakers horrified and two lives extinguished on foreign soil. This wasn't random violence or a robbery gone wrong. This was the latest chapter in a saga that began over 2 decades earlier, 2,000 kilometers away in the post-industrial wasteland of Glasgow. The bullets that ended 2 lives in Spain that night were fired in a war that had its roots in a simple drug theft in the summer of 2001, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister and the world was about to change forever after September 11th. The story you about to hear is one of the most chilling true stories in modern British criminal history, a real crime documentary that spans continents and generations, involving international cartels, political corruption, and a justice system that struggled to contain the violence spilling onto Glasgow's streets. Before we delve deeper into this dark history, take a moment to subscribe if you're fascinated by these investigative documentary stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. The Lyons-Daniel feud represents more than just another gang war. It's a window into how globalization transformed organized crime, how local disputes became international conflicts, and how the failure to address social inequality and drug addiction can fuel decades of violence. This is the story of 2 families whose hatred consumed not just themselves, but innocent bystanders, law enforcement resources, and the very fabric of communities trying to rebuild after industrial decline. To understand how we arrived at that bloody night in Spain, we must journey back to Glasgow at the turn of the millennium, when the city was still finding its identity after the collapse of its industrial heart, and when a new drug was about to transform the criminal landscape forever. In 2001, Glasgow was a city in transition, still bearing the scars of deindustrialization, but beginning to glimpse a different future. The shipyards that once employed tens of thousands had largely closed. The steelworks had fallen silent, and entire communities found themselves adrift without the industries that had defined them for generations. Into this vacuum stepped a different kind of enterprise, one that promised quick money to young men with few legitimate opportunities. The Daniel crime family had already established themselves as significant players in Glasgow's drug trade during the 1980s and 1990s. Led by Jamie Daniel, a veteran gangster who'd learned his trade during the city's transition from heavy industry to service economy. They'd built their reputation on heroin distribution. During those dark decades, cheap heroin flooded Glasgow's housing schemes, massive public housing projects that had become warehouses for the working class displaced by economic change. The social fabric of these communities, already strained by unemployment and poverty, was further torn apart by the addiction epidemic that followed. Jamie Daniel understood that drugs weren't just a business. They were a form of social control. communities ravaged by heroin became compliant, their young men either dead, imprisoned, or too consumed by addiction to cause trouble for established criminal enterprises. The Danyasus operated with the methodical precision of a corporation, maintaining territories, enforcing discipline, and eliminating competition with ruthless efficiency. But by 2001, a new product was arriving on Scottish shores, one that would reshape the entire criminal landscape. Cocaine, once the preserve of wealthy professionals and celebrities, was becoming increasingly available and affordable. Unlike heroin, which created a compliant underclass of addicts, cocaine created energetic, ambitious criminals willing to take enormous risks for enormous profits. The drug promised not just escape from Glasgow's post-industrial malaise, but actual wealth and status. The Danielle organization recognized this shift. They began storing significant quantities of cocaine in safe houses throughout North Glasgow, treating it with the same careful security that applied to heroin distribution. One such stash house was located in Milton, an area that exemplified Glasgow's urban decay. Rows of concrete housing blocks where unemployment rates soared and legitimate opportunities remained scarce. Milton was also home to something else, the Burnside Community Center, a focal point for local youth trying to find purpose and belonging in an environment that offered precious little of either. Around this community center, a group of teenagers had formed what they called the Club Boys, taking their name from their habit of gathering at the center. These were hardened criminals, but rather products of their environment. Young men coming of age in communities where traditional paths to success had largely disappeared. Among the Club Boys were two individuals whose names would become synonymous with decades of violence. Rosmonan, barely out of his teens, but already displaying the combination of ambition and recklessness that characterizes many successful criminals, and Eddie Lyons Jr., whose surname connected him to what would become the Danielle family's most implacable enemies. The theft that ignited the Lyons-Daniel feud was, in many ways, inevitable. Young criminals operating in the same geographic space as established drug dealers, with access to information about valuable stashes but lacking the institutional respect that prevents internal conflicts. According to investigators who later pieced together the events, the raid itself was audacious in its simplicity. The thieves struck when the safe house was unguarded, making off with the entire stash. More provocatively, they then sold the cocaine on Glasgow streets without offering any tribute to the Daniel organization, a direct challenge to the established criminal hierarchy. In the legitimate business world, such a theft might result in insurance claims and police reports. In Glasgow's underworld, it demanded blood. Jamie Donnell had built his reputation on the principle that challenges to his authority could not go unanswered. To ignore the theft would signal weakness to other potential rivals and undermine the fear that kept his organization's territories secure. The Dania family's demand for repayment and retribution met with defiant refusal from the Lyons organization. This wasn't simply about money, it was about respect, territory, and the unwritten rules that govern Glasgow's criminal underworld. The Lyons' refusal to make amends was itself a declaration of war, a statement that they were prepared to challenge the Daniel family's dominance regardless of the consequences. What followed was a gradual escalation that would define Glasgow's criminal landscape for the next quarter century. Both families began arming themselves, recruiting foot soldiers, and planning retaliation. The stage was set for a conflict that would consume multiple generations and eventually spread across continents. Among the Daniel family's enforcers, one figure would emerge who embodied the sadistic violence that would characterize much of the feud. Kevin Carroll, nicknamed Gerbel, due to his protruding teeth, was in his 20s when the conflict began, but he brought to it a personal vendetta that went beyond simple criminal rivalry. Carroll had reportedly been bullied by Lyons family members during his school years, and the feud offered him an opportunity for revenge that extended far beyond business considerations. Carroll's methods were designed not just to eliminate enemies, but to terrorize entire communities. His signature tactic, the so-called alien abductions, involved kidnapping rival dealers or Lyons associates, subjecting them to hours of torture, then dumping them half-naked and traumatized on Glasgow's streets. The psychological impact of these attacks extended far beyond their immediate victims. In communities already struggling with poverty and drug addiction, the knowledge that such violence could strike anyone connected, however peripherally, to the drug trade created an atmosphere of constant fear. The effectiveness of Carol's campaign lay not just in its brutality but in its impact on police investigations. Victims of alien abductions were typically so traumatized and terrified of further retaliation that they refused to cooperate with law enforcement. This created a climate of impunity that allowed the violence to escalate without meaningful intervention from authorities who were often overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of organized crime in post-industrial Glasgow. By 2006, 5 years after the initial theft, the feud had settled into a pattern of tit-for-tat violence that consumed resources and lives on both sides, without producing a clear victor. But Carol's next move would cross boundaries that even hardened criminals considered sacred, transforming what had been a business dispute into a deeply personal war that would span generations. The desecration of Gary Lyons' grave in November 2006 represented a turning point in the conflict-esque moral landscape. Gary Lyons had died of leukemia at age 8 in 1991. 15 years before the feud began and 10 years before his older brother Eddie Jr. would become involved in criminal activity. By any reasonable standard, a child's grave should have remained untouched by adult conflicts. Carol's decision to target the grave wasn't random violence, but calculated psychological warfare. He understood that the Lyons family's criminal activities were built on a foundation of family loyalty and masculine honor. By desecrating the grave of an innocent child, and doing so in the cover of darkness, like a coward, Carol was sending a message that no aspect of the Lyons family's life would remain sacred. The act shocked even Glasgow's criminal underworld, where certain boundaries had traditionally been respected. Veterans of the city's gang wars, men who'd witnessed decades of violence, found themselves genuinely appalled by the grave desecration. It represented a new low in criminal conduct, a crossing of moral lines that suggested the feud was spiraling beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. For the Lyons family, the grave desecration was both devastating and galvanizing. The attack on their deceased child member transformed the conflict from a business dispute into a matter of family honor that demanded the ultimate response. Eddie Lyons Jr. and his relatives were no longer simply defending criminal territory. They were avenging an assault on their family's memory and dignity. The psychological impact of the grave desecration cannot be overstated. In working-class Scottish culture, family bonds and respect for the dead carry profound significance. Carol's attack struck at the very heart of what the Lyons family held sacred, ensuring that any possibility of negotiated settlement had been permanently destroyed. The conflict was no longer about money or territory. It was about honor, revenge, and the fundamental question of whether such an assault could go unanswered. The Lyons family's response, when it came, would demonstrate that Carol's escalation had succeeded in provoking exactly the kind of deadly retaliation he seemed to crave. 3 weeks after the grave desecration, on December 6, 2006, the Lyons family delivered their answer with a precision that demonstrated how far Glasgow's gang warfare had evolved beyond street fights and petty violence. The attack on Apple Motors' garage in Lamb Hill represented a new level of operational sophistication, one that would set the template for much of the violence that followed. Apple Motors wasn't chosen at random. The garage was owned by a Lyons family member and served as both a legitimate business and an informal meeting place for the organization's associates. On that December morning, several Lyons family members had gathered at the garage for what should have been routine business. Instead, they found themselves targets in what would become one of Glasgow's most notorious gang killings. The two gunmen who entered Apple Motors that morning came prepared for war. Raymond Hammy Anderson and James MacDonald wore rubber masks, depicting elderly men, a grotesque theatrical touch that added psychological terror to their violent mission. These were opportunistic criminals, but Daniel family soldiers operating under direct orders to send a message that would resonate throughout Glasgow's underworld. The shooting itself was execution style in its brutality and precision. The masked gunmen opened fire with handguns in broad daylight, showing complete disregard for witnesses or police response. Their primary target was clear. Any Lyons family member unfortunate enough to be present would pay the price for their family's defiance of Daniel authority. 21-year-old Michael Lyons became the first fatality in what was already being recognized as a full-scale gang war. His death was particularly tragic because, by most accounts, he was relatively peripheral to the criminal activities that had sparked the conflict. Michael was Eddie Jr.'s first cousin, connected to the Lyons organization by blood rather than choice, making him both an obvious target and an essentially innocent victim. The two other casualties of the Apple Motors shooting survived their wounds, but carried permanent reminders of the day's violence. Stephen Lyons, Eddie Jr.'s brother, was shot in the stomach, but lived to continue the family's criminal activities. Robert Pickett, a Lyons family associate, was also wounded in the attack. Both men would later play significant roles in the ongoing conflict, their survival ensuring that first-hand witnesses to Daniel brutality remained alive to fuel desires for revenge. The Apple Motors shooting marked several troubling milestones in Scottish criminal history. It was one of the first gang killings to occur in such brazen circumstances: broad daylight, multiple witnesses, complete disregard for public safety. The attack demonstrated that Glasgow's crime families were prepared to wage war with a level of violence previously associated with Northern Ireland's sectarian conflict or international organized crime. Police response to the Apple Motors shooting revealed both the strengths and limitations of Scottish law enforcement. In dealing with organized crime, within 2 years, both Raymond Anderson and James MacDonald had been identified, captured, and brought to trial. The investigation that led to their conviction was thorough and professional, demonstrating that Scottish police possessed the technical capabilities to solve even complex gang-related murders. However, the sentences imposed on Anderson and MacDonald: life imprisonment, with minimum 35-year terms, while substantial, also highlighted the challenge facing law enforcement. These were foot soldiers, not the architects of the conflict. Jamie Daniel, Kevin Carroll, and other senior Daniel family members remained free to continue orchestrating violence, while their subordinates faced the consequences of carrying out orders. The judge's description of Michael Lyons' murder as a cold-blooded, premeditated execution captured both the calculated nature of the killing and its broader implications for Scottish society. This was not random violence or even traditional criminal activity. It was warfare being conducted on the streets of a major European city with innocent people caught in the crossfire. For the Lyons family, Michael's death represented both a devastating loss and a call to arms that could not be ignored. The young man's murder had crossed another line in the conflict's escalating brutality, transforming what had been a series of attacks and counterattacks into something approaching a blood feud that would demand satisfaction regardless of the cost in lives or freedom. The period following Michael Lyons' murder saw both families regroup and prepare for what everyone recognized would be an extended conflict. The Daniel family's success in eliminating a Lyons member had demonstrated their operational capabilities, but it had also guaranteed that retaliation was inevitable. The question wasn't whether the Lyons would strike back, but when, where, and how they would deliver their answer. Kevin Carroll continued his campaign of terror throughout this period, seemingly confident that his sadistic tactics had given the Daniel family a decisive psychological advantage. His alien abductions continued to traumatize rival dealers and Lyons associates, creating an atmosphere of fear that extended far beyond the immediate participants in the gang war. But Carroll's confidence would prove to be his downfall. His high-profile role in the conflict made him both a symbol of Daniel family power and an obvious target for Lyons' revenge. Moreover, his brutal methods had created a long list of potential enemies beyond just the Lyons organization. Every person he had tortured, every family member of his victims, every rival dealer who had been terrorized by his reputation had reason to want Kevin Carroll dead. The hunting season for Jabal Carroll was about to begin, and when it ended, the balance of power in Glasgow's criminal underworld would shift dramatically. The assassination of Kevin Carroll on January 13th marked a turning point in both the Lyons-Daniel feud and the broader evolution of organized crime in Scotland. The location chosen for the hit, the car park of an Asda supermarket in broad daylight, demonstrated a level of audacity that matched Carroll's own brutal methods while sending a clear message about the Lyons family's operational capabilities. Carroll's presence at the supermarket that day wasn't coincidental. According to police investigations, he had arranged to meet 2 drug associates, following what had become routine business practices for Glasgow's criminal organizations. The normalization of such meetings in public places reflected how embedded drug dealing had become in the city's SAD life, with major criminal figures conducting business alongside ordinary shoppers and families. The execution itself was carried out with military-style precision that impressed even experienced homicide investigators. 2 masked gunmen approached Carroll's Audi as he sat inside, trapped by the vehicle that had probably been chosen to provide security and quick escape routes. Instead, the car became his coffin as the assassins fired at least 10 shots at close range, ensuring that there would be no possibility of survival. The choice to carry out the assassination in such a public location, with numerous witnesses, including families with children, represented a calculated decision by the Lions organization. They were demonstrating that nowhere was safe for their enemies, that the Daniel family's reign of terror could be answered with equal brutality. The psychological impact of the killing extended far beyond its immediate target. Every Daniel family member now understood that they too could be hunted down and eliminated, regardless of where they felt secure. Police investigators faced the challenging task of solving a murder that had been witnessed by dozens of people, but where fear of retaliation made witnesses reluctant to cooperate. The investigation eventually identified nearly 100 potential suspects with motives for wanting Carroll dead, a testament to the number of enemies his brutal methods had created throughout Glasgow's underworld. The investigation's focus eventually narrowed to two primary suspects, both connected to the Lions organization. Ross Monahan, the same man who would later die in the Costa del Sol shooting, emerged as a prime suspect due to his known connections to the Lions family and his presence in Glasgow at the time of the killing. His arrest and subsequent trial in 2012 demonstrated the Scottish justice system's commitment to prosecuting gang violence, but also highlighted the evidentiary challenges involved in such cases. Monahan's acquittal in May 2012, while legally proper given the insufficient evidence, illustrated the practical difficulties of securing convictions in gang-related murders. Witnesses remained terrified of retaliation. Physical evidence was limited, and the complex web of relationships within Glasgow's criminal underworld made it difficult to establish clear chains of command and responsibility. The second suspect, William Buff Patterson, represented a different archetype within Glasgow's criminal hierarchy. Patterson was a Lyons family associate who had grown up alongside Ross Monahan and Eddie Lyons Jr. as part of the original Milton Club boys. His evolution from community center teenager to professional assassin illustrated the tragic trajectory that too many young men from Glasgow deprived areas had followed during the city's post-industrial transition. Patterson's flight from Scotland immediately after Carroll's murder suggested consciousness of guilt, but it also demonstrated the international networks that Glasgow's crime families had developed. His ability to remain hidden in Spain for several years before being captured illustrated how local gang conflicts had become entangled with broader patterns of international organized crime. When Patterson was finally brought to trial in 2015, his conviction for Carroll's murder provided some measure of justice for the Daniel family and closure for law enforcement agencies that had been investigating the case for 5 years. His life sentence, with a minimum 22-year term, reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the court's recognition that this had been a professional assassination rather than a spontaneous act of violence. The period immediately following Carroll's death saw what many hoped would be a permanent reduction in the intensity of the Lyons-Daniel feud. Both sides had suffered significant casualties. The Lyons had lost Michael Lyons, while the Daniels had seen their most feared enforcer eliminated. The arrest and imprisonment of several key figures from both organizations further reduced their operational capabilities. More importantly, the leadership of both crime families was aging and facing increasing pressure from law enforcement agencies that had developed more sophisticated methods for investigating organized crime. Jamie Daniel, the patriarch of the Daniel organization, was battling health issues that limited his ability to direct day-to-day operations. On the Lyons side, several senior members were dealing with their own legal troubles, including prosecutions for financial crimes that diverted attention from the gang war. Glasgow police had also adapted their tactics in response to the escalating violence. Specialized units devoted to investigating organized crime had been expanded and given additional resources. Intelligence gathering had improved, with better coordination between different law enforcement agencies and increased use of surveillance technology. The naive hope among some officials was that a combination of successful prosecutions and enhanced police pressure might finally bring the feud to an end. However, this period of relative calm would prove to be merely a pause rather than a conclusion. The underlying issues that had fueled the conflict, control of lucrative drug territories, family honor, and the cycle of revenge that had claimed multiple lives, remained unresolved. Moreover, the globalization of organized crime was creating new opportunities and new pressures that would eventually reignite the violence with even greater intensity. The death of Jamie Daniel in July 2016 from cancer at age 58 created a power vacuum within the Daniel organization that would have far-reaching consequences for Glasgow's criminal landscape. Daniel had been more than just a crime boss. He was an old-school gangster who understood the importance of maintaining certain boundaries and avoiding the kind of spectacular, public violence that attracted unwanted police attention. Under Jamie Daniels' leadership, the feud with the Lyons family had been kept within manageable limits. While both sides had suffered casualties, the violence had generally been targeted and controlled, designed to send messages rather than wage total war. Daniel's death removed this restraining influence just as a new generation of more reckless criminals was emerging within both organizations. The leadership vacuum within the Daniel organization coincided with significant changes in the Lyons family's operational structure. Stevie Lyons, a close relative of Eddie Lyons Jr., who had survived the 2006 Lamb Hill garage attack, had spent years overseas recovering from his wounds and building international connections. His base in Spain, and later Dubai, reflected the increasingly global nature of organized crime and the opportunities this presented for ambitious criminals. From his exile in the United Arab Emirates, Stevie Lyons had cultivated relationships with major international drug trafficking organizations, most notably Ireland's powerful Kinahan cartel. These connections transformed the Lyons family from a local Glasgow gang into a component of an international criminal network capable of importing and distributing cocaine on a massive scale. The alliance between the Lyons family and the Kinahan cartel represented a fundamental shift in how organized crime operated in 21st century Europe. Local territorial disputes were becoming entangled with international drug trafficking routes, money laundering operations, and sophisticated criminal enterprises that spanned multiple jurisdictions. This globalization of crime created both opportunities and vulnerabilities for traditional crime families. With Jamie Daniel dead and the Lyons family backed by international criminal networks, the balance of power in Glasgow's underworld had shifted dramatically. Stephen Lyons and his associates sensed an opportunity to finally eliminate their longtime enemies and seize control of the Daniel family's traditional territories. The result would be an explosion of violence that surpassed anything seen during the previous 15 years of conflict. The Lyons family's offensive campaign in late 2016 and early 2017 demonstrated how much Glasgow's gang warfare had evolved since the simple drug theft that had started the conflict. The 5 attempted murders carried out in just 5 months represented a level of sustained violence that overwhelmed law enforcement resources and terrorized communities throughout the city. The attack on Stephen Bonzo Daniel in May 2017 became emblematic of the feud's escalating brutality. The use of tracking devices to monitor Daniel's movements showed sophisticated surveillance capabilities, while the high-speed chase through North Glasgow streets demonstrated complete disregard for public safety. The machete attack that left Daniel permanently disfigured crossed new boundaries in terms of both violence and psychological warfare. Police testimony about Daniel's injuries, describing how his nose was hanging off on the left-hand side near his ear, illustrated the savage nature of the attack. The fact that paramedics initially thought he had been shot in the face because of the extent of his injuries demonstrated the level of violence that had become routine in the Lyons-Daniel conflict. Other attacks during this period showed similar patterns of escalation. The firebombing of Daniel associates' homes, the sword attack on Ryan Fitzsimmons, and multiple attempted murders all demonstrated that the Lyons organization had decided to wage total war against their enemies, regardless of the consequences for innocent bystanders or their own legal exposure. The targeting of Ryan Fitzsimmons was particularly significant because it showed how the conflict had expanded beyond the original participants to encompass extended family networks and business associates. Fitzsimmons was attacked because his brother Martin was awaiting trial for attempting to murder Ross Monaghan, illustrating how cycles of revenge were creating ever-widening circles of violence and retaliation. The refusal of victims and witnesses to cooperate with police investigations reflected both fear of retaliation and a broader breakdown in trust between Glasgow's communities and law enforcement. As one investigator noted, people caught up in Lyons-Daniel violence often conveniently forgot their testimony, understanding that cooperation with police could result in deadly consequences for themselves and their families. Police Scotland's determination to break this cycle of violence led to a major investigation that would ultimately result in the prosecution of 6 Lyons associates for conspiracy to murder and other violent offenses. The successful conviction of these men in May 2019, resulting in collective sentences totaling over 104 years in prison, represented a significant victory for law enforcement and demonstrated that even sophisticated criminal organizations could be defeated through careful investigation and prosecution. Judge Lord Mulholland's comments during sentencing captured both the seriousness of the crimes and their broader impact on Scottish society. His observation that the defendants had sought to turn Glasgow into a war zone reflected public concern about the normalization of extreme violence in a major European city. His emphasis on Scotland being a civilized country based on the rule of law represented a direct challenge to criminal organizations that sought to establish their own brutal codes of conduct. The successful prosecution of the Lyons associates seemed to offer hope that the feud might finally be brought under control through the application of conventional law enforcement methods. However, the imprisonment of foot soldiers while senior leaders remained free had historically done little to end the underlying conflict. Moreover, new players were emerging in Glasgow's criminal underworld who would bring fresh violence and international complications to the decades-old dispute. As 2019 turned to 2020, with many Lyons soldiers behind bars and Stephen Lyons reportedly ordering a halt to direct attacks from his Dubai exile, Glasgow experienced another brief period of relative calm. But this pause in violence would prove to be merely the calm before an even more devastating storm, one that would involve new criminal networks, social media warfare, and a level of public violence that would shock even a city accustomed to gang warfare. The emergence of Ross Miami. McGill, as a major player in organized crime, represented a new evolution in how international criminal networks operated in the 21st century. McGill's background as a former Rangers football club hooligan who had relocated to Dubai illustrated how globalization had created opportunities for ambitious criminals to reinvent themselves on an international stage. From his Dubai base, McGill had built what intelligence sources described as a sophisticated drug trafficking network operating under the cryptic name Tamo Junto, Portuguese, for we are together. This choice of name reflected the increasingly international nature of organized crime, with Scottish criminals adopting terminology from South American drug cartels and operating across multiple continents. McGill's nickname Miami captured both his flamboyant lifestyle and his frequent travels, suggesting someone who saw himself as operating on a different level from traditional Glasgow gangsters. His emergence as a major figure coincided with Dubai's growing reputation as a safe haven for international criminals seeking to escape law enforcement in their home countries. The collision between McGill's operation and the remnants of the Lyons-Daniel feud occurred through the kind of business dispute that had historically sparked much criminal violence. McGill's alleged experience of being paid with counterfeit cash for a cocaine consignment represented exactly the kind of challenge to criminal authority that demanded violent response in underworld culture. The connection of this fraud to Mark Richardson, an Edinburgh-based drug kingpin and Daniel family ally, provided McGill with both a target for revenge and an opportunity to insert himself into Glasgow's established criminal hierarchies. Richardson's imprisonment since 2018 on major drug and gun trafficking charges had left his criminal network vulnerable to exactly the kind of takeover that McGill seemed to be planning. McGill's proposal to the Lyons family help eliminate the Richardson-Daniel faction in exchange for shared profits represented a strategic alliance that would transform the nature of the conflict. The Lyons organization, while still dangerous, had been weakened by arrests and the exile of senior leadership. An alliance with a well-funded international criminal like McGill offered them the resources and manpower needed to finally eliminate their longtime enemies. The explosion of violence that followed in 2022 and 2023 demonstrated how traditional gang conflicts could be amplified and modernized by new criminal networks. McGill's campaign of firebombings and drive-by shootings was carried out with a level of public spectacle that seemed designed as much for social media impact as for intimidation of specific targets. The use of social media to document and publicize attacks represented a fundamental shift in how criminal organizations operated. Rather than seeking to avoid attention, McGill's associates filmed their attacks and posted videos online with musical soundtracks and taunting captions. This transformation of criminal violence into entertainment content reflected broader changes in how information and intimidation operated in the digital age. The sophistication of McGill's social media campaign suggested resources and expertise that went far beyond traditional Glasgow gang capabilities. The professional quality of the videos their strategic distribution, and their psychological impact indicated that this was warfare being conducted according to 21st century principles of information warfare and brand management. By late 2023, the scale of violence had reached levels not seen in Scotland for decades. Dozens of incidents across Scotland's central belt included homes and cars being firebombed, businesses torched, and even family members of gang figures attacked. The geographic spread of the violence, from Edinburgh to Glasgow and beyond, demonstrated that this was no longer a local territorial dispute, but a regional criminal war. The attack on a taxi belonging to the father of McGill's girlfriend in May 2024 illustrated how the conflict had expanded to target even peripheral family connections. This escalation to attacking family members who had no direct involvement in criminal activities represented another crossing of traditional boundaries that had historically limited gang violence. The fact that shots were fired into homes containing children in early 2024 demonstrated the complete abandonment of any restraints on violence. The 4 coordinated firebombings carried out almost simultaneously in April 2025 showed operational capabilities that rivaled those of terrorist organizations, with the added horror that one attack targeted a home where a child was sleeping. Scottish authorities' acknowledgement that over 100 officers were devoted to investigating the firebombings and shootings illustrated both the scale of the problem and the resources required to combat it. The police unionist's warnings about chronic underfunding and stretched frontline officers highlighted systemic issues that went beyond the immediate criminal threat. The international dimensions of the conflict, particularly the entanglement with the Kinahan cartel, represented a fundamental challenge to traditional law enforcement approaches. Local police forces, however well-intentioned and professional, were attempting to combat criminal networks that operated across multiple jurisdictions and had access to resources that rivaled those of small nations. The interception of the MV Matthew cocaine shipment in 2023, with its cargo worth £157 million, provided a glimpse into the scale of international drug trafficking that had become entangled with the Lyons-Daniel feud. The suspected involvement of Lyons clan members in coordinating this massive shipment for the Kinahans illustrated how a local Glasgow dispute had become part of a global criminal enterprise. The double murder in Fuengirola represented not just another casualty in the Lyons-Daniel feud, but potentially the trigger for an international criminal war involving some of Europe's most dangerous, organized crime groups. The speculation in Irish media that the killings might drag the Kinahan cartel into a fresh mob war indicated how local conflicts could escalate into international crises with implications far beyond their origins. As we reach the present day, the Lyons-Daniel feud stands as a testament to how local criminal disputes can evolve into international conflicts that span generations and continents. What began as a simple drug theft in Milton, Glasgow, in 2001 had by 2025 become a sprawling criminal war involving multiple countries, sophisticated criminal networks, and violence that shocked even seasoned observers of organized crime. The evolution of this conflict parallels broader changes in how organized crime operates in the globalized 21st century. Local territorial disputes have become entangled with international drug trafficking routes, money laundering operations, and criminal networks that span multiple continents. The ability of criminals to flee jurisdiction, establish operations in multiple countries, and coordinate complex criminal enterprises across borders has fundamentally changed the nature of organized crime. The human cost of this evolution has been enormous. Beyond the confirmed deaths directly attributable to the feud, the conflict has consumed law enforcement resources, terrorized communities, and created a climate of fear that has affected thousands of innocent people. Children have grown up in neighborhoods where gang violence was routine. Families have been displaced by firebombings, and entire communities have been held hostage by criminal organizations that operated with apparent impunity. The failure to resolve the Lyons-Daniel feud also represents a broader failure to address the underlying social and economic conditions that made such conflicts possible. The post-industrial decline of Glasgow created communities where legitimate opportunities were scarce and criminal enterprises offered the primary path to economic advancement. The drug addiction epidemics that followed deindustrialization provided both markets for criminal products and recruitment pools for criminal organizations. The globalization of crime has also highlighted the limitations of national law enforcement systems in dealing with international criminal networks. While individual officers and prosecutors have shown remarkable dedication and professionalism, They have been fighting with 20th century tools against 21st century criminal enterprises that operate across multiple jurisdictions and have access to resources that rival those of governments. The social media dimension of recent violence represents another evolution that law enforcement agencies are still struggling to understand and combat. The transformation of criminal violence into social media content has created new forms of intimidation and recruitment, while providing criminal organizations with unprecedented propaganda capabilities. Looking forward, the Lyons-Daniel feud serves as a cautionary tale about how local criminal disputes can evolve into international conflicts with implications far beyond their origins. The involvement of major international criminal organizations like the Kinahan cartel means that resolution of the conflict may not depend on factors entirely outside the control of Scottish authorities. The continuing presence of key figures like Stephen Lyons in Dubai, beyond the reach of Scottish law enforcement, ensures that the potential for renewed violence remains high. The international nature of modern drug trafficking means that disputes can remain dormant for years before exploding into violence when business interests align with personal vendettas. Perhaps most troublingly, the success of criminal organizations in building international networks and establishing operations across multiple jurisdictions suggests that the Lyons-Daniel feud may represent not an aberration, but a preview of how organized crime will operate in the future. Local law enforcement agencies may find themselves increasingly outmatched by criminal networks that have evolved into truly transnational enterprises, operating beyond the reach of any single national government. The legacy of the Lyons-Daniel feud extends far beyond the specific individuals and organizations involved. It represents a case study in how social inequality, economic displacement, and inadequate policy responses can create conditions where criminal violence becomes endemic. The transformation of Glasgow from an industrial powerhouse to a post-industrial city struggling with unemployment and social decay provided the perfect environment for organized crime to flourish. The international ramifications of what began as a local dispute also illustrate how globalization has fundamentally altered the nature of criminal enterprise. The same technologies and economic systems that have enabled legitimate businesses to operate across borders have also empowered criminal organizations to build networks that span continents. The ability of figures like Stephen Lyons and Ross McGill to direct operations from Dubai, while their foot soldiers carry out violence in Glasgow, represents a new model of criminal organization that traditional law enforcement approaches struggle to address. The use of Spain's Costa del Sol as a safe haven for British criminals reflects broader patterns of how international criminal networks exploit differences in legal systems and law enforcement capabilities. The region's combination of established British expatriate communities, relaxed financial oversight, and geographic proximity to major drug trafficking routes has made it an ideal base for criminals seeking to escape domestic law enforcement while maintaining operational control over their organizations. The involvement of the Kinahan cartel adds another layer of complexity to the conflict's international dimensions. As one of Europe's most powerful drug trafficking organizations, the Kinahans bring resources and capabilities that dwarf those of traditional Glasgow gangs. Their alliance for the Lyons family represents a fundamental shift in the balance of power that has implications extending far beyond Scotland's borders. The social media warfare that has characterized recent phases of the conflict represents another evolution that law enforcement agencies are struggling to understand and combat. The professional quality of videos documenting attacks, their strategic distribution across social media platforms, and their psychological impact on both rivals and communities suggest that criminal organizations have begun to appreciate the power of information warfare in achieving their objectives. This digital dimension of modern criminal conflicts presents unique challenges for law enforcement agencies that were designed to combat traditional forms of criminal activity. The global reach of social media platforms means that intimidation and recruitment can occur across international borders, while the speed and scale of digital communication allows criminal organizations to coordinate complex operations in ways that were impossible in previous eras. The failure of traditional law enforcement approaches to prevent or resolve the Lyons-Daniel feud also highlights systemic issues within the criminal justice system. While individual prosecutions have been successful in removing specific criminals from the streets, they have done little to address the underlying organizational structures that enable such conflicts to persist. Across multiple generations. The phenomenon of foot soldiers being imprisoned while senior leadership remains free to recruit replacements and continue operations has been a persistent feature of the conflict. This pattern suggests that criminal justice approaches focused on individual prosecutions may be inadequate for dealing with organizational criminal enterprises that can adapt to and survive the loss of specific members. The international nature of modern criminal organizations also presents jurisdictional challenges that national law enforcement agencies are poorly equipped to address. While international cooperation has improved significantly in recent decades, the practical difficulties of coordinating investigations and prosecutions across multiple countries with different legal systems continue to provide advantages to criminal organizations willing to exploit these complexities. The economic dimensions of the conflict reflect broader patterns of how illegal drug markets have evolved in response to changing social conditions and law enforcement strategies. The transition from heroin to cocaine as the primary product driving criminal conflicts paralleled broader social changes with cocaine's association with wealth and status, making it attractive to a new generation of criminals seeking not just survival, but genuine affluence. The massive profits generated by international drug trafficking have provided criminal organizations with resources that enabled them to corrupt officials, purchase sophisticated equipment, and maintain operations across multiple countries. The £157 million cocaine shipment intercepted in 2023 provides just one example of the scale of resources available to modern criminal organizations. These economic realities suggest that traditional law enforcement approaches focused on disrupting individual criminal activities may be insufficient to address the broader structural factors that make organized crime profitable. The continuing demand for illegal drugs, combined with the enormous profits available to those willing to supply that demand, creates economic incentives that can overcome most law enforcement deterrents. The community impact of the Lyons-Daniel feud extends far beyond the immediate participants in criminal activities. Residents of affected neighborhoods have lived with the constant possibility of violence erupting in their communities. Children have grown up witnessing criminal activity as a normal part of daily life, and legitimate businesses have struggled to operate in areas controlled by criminal organizations. The psychological impact of this chronic exposure to violence cannot be understated. Communities that have experienced decades of gang warfare develop cultures of silence and fear that make normal civic life difficult to maintain. The reluctance of witnesses to cooperate with police investigations reflects not just fear of retaliation, but a broader breakdown in trust between communities and law enforcement agencies. This erosion of social capital has long-term consequences that extend beyond immediate criminal activity. When communities lose confidence in the ability of legitimate institutions to protect them, they become more vulnerable to criminal influence and less likely to participate in the civic activities that are essential for healthy democratic societies. The international attention that the Lyons-Daniel feud has attracted also reflects broader concerns about how organized crime has evolved in the 21st century. Law enforcement agencies across Europe and beyond are grappling with similar challenges as local criminal organizations develop international capabilities and form alliances with foreign criminal enterprises. The success of Scottish criminals in establishing operations across multiple countries demonstrates that the problem extends far beyond any single nation's borders. The use of Dubai as a base for directing operations in Glasgow, the alliance with Irish criminal organizations, and the utilization of Spanish territory as a safe haven all illustrate how modern criminal enterprises have adapted to globalization more quickly than the law enforcement agencies tasked with combating them. Academic researchers studying organized crime have increasingly focused on the Lyons-Daniel feud as a case study in how local criminal disputes can evolve into international conflicts. The longitudinal nature of the conflict, spanning more than 2 decades, provides insights into how criminal organizations adapt to changing circumstances and how law enforcement responses evolve over time. The documentation of the conflict through court records, police investigations, and media coverage has created an unusually detailed record of how modern organized crime operates. This documentation has proven valuable for understanding not just the specific dynamics of the Lyons-Daniel feud, but broader patterns of criminal behavior that appear to be emerging across multiple jurisdictions. Policymakers have also studied the conflict as an example of how social and economic policies can inadvertently create conditions that favor criminal organizations. The correlation between deindustrialization, community decline, and the emergence of organized crime has implications for how governments approach economic development and social policy. The failure to address underlying social conditions that made the Lyons-Daniel feud possible suggests that purely law enforcement responses may be insufficient for preventing similar conflicts in the future. Investment in education, economic development, and community building may be more effective long-term strategies for preventing organized crime than increased policing and prosecution alone. As this investigation concludes, the Lyons-Daniel feud stands as one of the most significant criminal conflicts in modern British history. Its evolution from a simple drug theft to an international criminal war involving major organized crime groups illustrates fundamental changes in how criminal enterprises operate in the globalized world. The human cost of this conflict, measured not just in lives lost, but in communities terrorized, families destroyed, and social fabric torn apart, serves as a reminder of the real-world consequences of organized crime. The victims of this violence were not just criminals who chose to participate in illegal activities, but innocent people who found themselves caught up in conflicts they had no part in creating. The continuing nature of the threat, with key figures still at large, and international criminal alliances still intact, suggests that the final chapter of this story has yet to be written. The potential for renewed violence remains high as long as the underlying disputes remain unresolved and the international criminal networks that have become entangled in the conflict continue to operate. Perhaps most importantly, the Lyons-Daniel feud serves as a warning about how local criminal disputes can evolve into international conflicts with implications far beyond their origins. In an increasingly interconnected world, the failure to address organized crime in one jurisdiction can have consequences that extend across borders and affect multiple nations. The lessons learned from this decades-long conflict about the importance of addressing underlying social conditions, the need for international cooperation in combating transnational crime, and the limitations of traditional law enforcement approaches in dealing with modern criminal enterprises will likely influence how governments and law enforcement agencies approach organized crime for years to come. The story of the Lyons-Daniel feud ultimately stands as a testament to both human resilience and human destructiveness. Communities that have endured decades of criminal violence have shown remarkable strength in maintaining their social bonds and commitment to peaceful resolution of conflicts. At the same time, the willingness of criminal organizations to perpetrate extreme violence in pursuit of profit and revenge demonstrates the depths to which human behavior can sink when unconstrained by effective social and legal institutions. As we close this examination of one of Britain's most persistent criminal conflicts, the questions it raises about social inequality, international cooperation, and the nature of justice in a globalized world remain as relevant today as they were when the first shots were fired over a stolen drug stash in Glasgow more than 2 decades ago. The answers to these questions may well determine whether future generations will face similar conflicts or whether human societies can develop more effective approaches to preventing and resolving the conditions that give rise to organized crime. The blood spilled on a warm Spanish night in May 2025 represents not just the latest casualties in a long-running criminal war, but a reminder that the price of failing to address these fundamental challenges is measured in human lives lost and communities destroyed. The true crime story of the Lyons-Daniel feud continues to unfold, and its ultimate resolution may well depend on our collective ability to learn from its lessons and apply them to the broader challenge of building more just and peaceful societies.